right, welcome, Robin. So we are going to do an interview prep with you today so that you can get ready for your position for a clinical operations lead. So my first question for you is, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and then go into your high level of your recent experiences, and maybe on the last 2 recent experiences, dive a little deeper in what exactly you do.
Okay. So, my name is Robin Noguchi. I'm a senior clinical trial manager at Elector. At Elector, we are running an Alzheimer's study. I am the study lead. I'm the counterpart for the CRO, PM. In our trial, we're trying to enroll 265 patients at 12 different countries and 75 sites. So in our 12 countries, we're in North America, Canada, and US, and we're also in Argentina, and we're in Europe, Spain, Italy, France, Poland, the UK, and the Netherlands, and then we're also in Australia and New Zealand. So from there, my goals are to really help recruitment. So far, we've enrolled 150 patients and also reached 50% milestones for our ETMF. In addition to that, we have certain biomarkers that are very important that we collect. And we've implemented a TOWR working group to make sure we get this biomarker. And this is based on, specific efforts that we generated as a PET working group to ensure that the study is getting all of the clinical data points that are very critical for our study. So prior to Elector, I was at Genentech, and at Genentech, I was in both USMA and GRED. I was in USMA for 1 year running an oncology study in the US only, in about 20 different sites in the US. And then in GRED, I ran a variety of different trials. So I ran some that I led and some that I supported. So I have 3 years of neuroscience experience total and overall. And then 1 year of immunology, 3 years of oncology, 3 years in ClinPharm, and 2 years in aesthetic trials, 2 years doing medical devices prior to Genentech, and then 7 years in pharma. And of that time in GRED running clinical pharm studies, I usually led those ones and some phase 1 studies. But when I was supporting, I was on some phase 2s for melanoma, the personalized cancer vaccine, and also, sorry, Hillary, your face is so serious. The personalized cancer vaccine, and also breast cancer and oncology, oncology studies.
Wonderful, thank you. Overall, what do you think are traits that you have that help lead the success of running clinical trials?
For me, the quality, is that what you mentioned? The quality that I have that helps me lead trials. I think the quality that I bring is my leadership and my passion for, really working with a team, collaboration, and making sure that we're all aligned, collaborating well together, and having a cohesive, calm environment. So I think that's the element that I add as a study lead.
Wonderful. If you don't mind, maybe can you give me an example of that leadership? Because I do think that's going to be something really important, where you can dive a little bit, maybe like an example of when you had good leadership, and especially in terms of what you mentioned, where you helped create a calm environment through your leadership.
An example of where I can create a calm environment is even if there's an issue, right? No matter what it is, you're just like, okay, so what is it? What happened? Give me all the details, ask really good questions. And then if it seems like something is escalating or someone's not too happy, you just kind of call them out on it and, just say, oh, no, that wasn't meant to be X, Y, or Z, depending on how you feel that emotion might be coming across. And then just clarifying what you're trying to get at, like, I didn't mean to say that, maybe somebody didn't do something right, or, just trying to make sure it's very clear on what the goal is and trying to move forward, not really focusing on pointing fingers, but, just to create a great path going forward so that progress can still be made.
Yep, sounds great. Can you give a specific example of like when, not that your general example is perfect and you definitely want to speak to that, but do you have a specific like example that you can share regarding that?
So just in a display of good leadership, like give an example of where maybe something.
Well, and I think in general, we want like the overall format is that any question they ask, make sure you kind of, give like a quick summary of kind of like, this is my model, this is my leadership style, this is how I handle situations, and then give a very specific concrete example. And then also like reiterate the outcome of that example, like kind of what you mentioned, but like worked with the person to see how they felt. And this is kind of how, and then you want to do, at least what I've been told per Genentech, is that you want to do what's the outcome, but then like a second step of what is the outcome for like the company, like how did you resolving that leadership situation lead to like more success in the company. So just any sort of leadership, but I would recommend, because I know you're good at this, recommend giving a leadership example of when you there was a conflict and you helped calm it down. So it could be like, I know from our history that you were great with like your CRO and also just keeping a cool head. So I think you'd want to give an example of that.
So while you were describing kind of what you're looking for, I thought of an example where I was working with my clinical scientist and we're just going back and forth on an email thread, and he was asking for information. And so when I gave him examples of the information that I was trying to figure out what he was looking for, and in this case, it was specific optional biomarker data, right? He wanted to know how much we actually had. So that's very vague, right? Because you might want to know how many patients consented for it and how many did we actually collect versus, how many have been offered it, right? So there's many aspects of when you ask a question like, what are you collecting? So to give the background, he reported to our partner that we had about 30% collection of this very important biomarker, which they thought was not bad, right? So in actuality, what the previous study lead had told them was that we have 30% consent, which is not the same as having a collection, right? So once he found out we didn't actually collect 30% of patients' biomarker samples, he was furious by email, you could tell. He started escalating and looping people in, and then so for me, I just go to the source and I ask, it seems that there was a little miscommunication. Somebody's under the impression that, we have 30% of this specific biomarker collected and we haven't. So I'm wondering what you actually shared that makes this person think that we have 30%. And he's concerned and very upset because he told the partner that we have something that we don't actually have, right? And so he's looking bad to this external partner that's very important to the collaboration for the whole company. So when I find out the details, yes, we provided the number of consents we have for that optional biomarker assessment. So I clarified, you asked how many that you had, but you were very vague. You didn't say how many consents did we have or how many samples did we actually collect. So I'm clarifying you that yes, indeed, we do have 30% consents for the optional biomarkers, but we don't have that collected. This is what we do have. And going forward, this is what we can suggest. We created this PEP working group to make sure that we could collect those in the future. And then we just put this whole working group together to make sure that, you didn't communicate the wrong information to to our partner. It's just you communicated something else that you thought you were communicating. And nobody did anything wrong. It's just there was some miscommunication, and we'll move forward by working to collect what you need in the time that you need it. So it was more of that. I mean, he wasn't super happy, but he was happy that at least he knew now rather than later at the end of the study, right? So
yeah, awesome. I think it's really great that you added that you what was the resolution and kind of what was your plan for correcting this in the future. And I think that's a perfect, that whole situation. I definitely think that in your interview, you should bring that up, right? So try to find that's a really good, solid example of a conflict that happened. And I think it also shares your knowledge of the situation and how your experience of how things can go wrong, right? That shows that you've been in situations so you can handle things in the future. And then, but very much this is what I did to solve it, and this is what I did to prevent it, right? So I think definitely solid example, and bring up the, like, you created a working group, and that you can even like add to it, like maybe you have a dashboard that's really clear now, you know, and you can always feel free to embellish things a little bit and make it so that, like, you know, sometimes it's okay to add like your dream to the situation, be like, okay, and then, you know, we have plans to create a dashboard that would make it super clear so that people can see what's consented and what's actually done, and, you know, but yeah, really like that example. That was really good. Okay, my next question is, give an example of sharing feedback and lessons learned. And again, same format, give me, you know, overview of your kind of your philosophy on the topic, very concrete, specific example, the outcome, and then like kind of the outcome to the company and any sort of like future goals for it.
So sharing feedback and lessons learned. I feel like we've discussed this one, Hillary. I'm going to do it again and see if it's any better. So I was preparing a investigator site engagement meeting in February, and I didn't realize that my clinical scientist likes to procrastinate. And so we were very, you know, we created this official timelines, and we said, like, this is when we're going to do this round of review. And he didn't, you know, really participate in that portion of the timeline. And so as we were getting closer, his slides were not made for the meeting. And then my CPM, she went in and she noticed there was no slides, and she was very concerned and panicked. So I sort of created this lessons learned. So when you prepare for an investigative site engagement meeting, you know how to have all of the buy-in from everyone as you create the timeline. Actually, this is not a good lessons learned. Now that I think about it, this is actually really bad. But anyway, the point that I want to deliver is that, you know, just if you really plan ahead and you know what ideally should happen, then the lessons learned are less significant, right? So basically the lesson learned was, because we didn't have all the buy-in initially from this person, of course, they were not going to participate in getting things on time. Of course, everything was ready and delivered at the meeting because it has to be. But I think the lesson learned there was this: you have to really communicate well and make sure who's ever involved and the deliverable person responsible needs to agree to those timelines. Because if they don't, you can't really expect them to like follow your timelines, which is not necessarily the greatest lessons learned, but I think it's just communication in general, right? You have to be very transparent and open, and you have to get buy-in from your team, because if you don't get buy-in from your team, you're not going to get results. So I would just say that, you know, in the future, what I stressed to the team was that, you know, you really want to plan all of this in advance, but no matter how much you plan, if you don't get buy-in from people, it's not really going to work out.
Yeah, no, agreed. And I definitely think I'll rephrase my question and we'll do a second round of it. But I think that's overall is a good situation to bring up. And I think you can even add things like, okay, like in the future, we set up a plan to, like, I've had similar situations. And I think just for the team to hear that, sometimes what I've done is I've like had like a signature thing, like, you know, if people sign things, I think people feel like much more accountable. And so you could do something where you like form your little committee. Here's everybody who's going to provide slides. Here's our timelines, and then make them like sign it. Because I feel like people are like much more freaked out and like will actually read the document, especially if it's simple, right? Very high level, make them sign it, and then like make them attend meetings. And if they don't attend, like the second one should like be like based only on their availability, you know, because I've had very similar situations, and it was also clinical science who like refused to show up. So I definitely think that's a very common situation for everybody else to learn from. So you definitely want to have buy-in from your team. So I think overall the story in making sure you have buy-in is good. I think what we should do is, for this question, which is a question that I think comes up for this interview, is sharing an example of like when you provided feedback. So not really like, and I think I made a mistake by saying lessons learned. Just think about it as feedback. And basically the question is more like, when have you provided feedback to either a vendor or like an employee or like a manager, and like how did it go? So that's my second question.
Okay. So for feedback, right, it could be positive or negative.
Yeah.
And then this particular example that I would give is like me working with my direct report, right? So I always want to start with, positives and negatives. So if there's a good balance, or if it's not negative, it's just neutral, right? It's not super bad, but it's to the point where they're getting feedback to grow. So I think I always want to come in with the good and the not so good. So I might say like, oh, these are the great things that you did this week. These are the top 3. And then, these are the things that we should prioritize this week, and then focus on like, for this one, maybe they're not as careful doing spell check or something. So you might just remind them. So you're not necessarily telling them that they're not thorough and detailed, but you kind of say, can you take extra time to actually make sure that this part is thoroughly reviewed, and that there's no errors when you send this part? And then you might talk about, for example, if you heard that maybe they were late returning something, you might say, oh, and why don't you try to get it done the day before? And then we can go over it together. So that might be an example of how you might do it with like a direct report, which is not relevant to this position.
No, I think it is. Yeah, it's not as relevant to this position. So maybe do a vendor. And I think, so maybe you could do like an issue you had with your vendor, and then how you provide feedback about it. And then again, like those kind of outcomes, like then what, and again, you can also just like in the interview, if you need to, you can like make up a story, or like, just so apply the lessons that you're mentioning, but then just like make it as a concrete, like for an IM, I did this, or there was a specific issue that this vendor had, give a little details on the background. Because that was one feedback that a friend of mine had in her genetic interview, was that she got that they want very concrete examples, and she didn't give enough background. She kind of like just jumped into the situation. They want a little bit of like a background. So like, when I was in this position and I was doing X, I had this vendor, and then we were working on an IM and they didn't do what they're supposed to do, and that's like give like details to everything, but then touch on what you did, and then like, and then what you did to like provide the feedback. So kind of like how you maybe solve the issue, how you provide feedback, and then kind of how you built in a system in place to prevent that issue from coming. And then again, what Genentech, at least this is what I've been told, and this is what I did in my interview, is at the end of each thing, it's a little awkward, but you talk about like how this benefits the company. And so like, I usually relate it to like, oh, and then, or like your biomarker situation. This is really important that the correct biomarkers get collected, so that we know, so the patients, so we can have data on the patients. And it was also important for like funding with the partner, right? So you like tie it to like a bigger than the current situation. Okay. So yeah, think of a vendor specific situation that you had.
Okay. So the situation that's coming to mind is an imaging vendor that we're working with. So for a patient, in order for a patient to be enrolled to our study, they have a baseline MRI scan, right? So they take their scan, they send it to the vendor, and then they read it, right? And then they give us the result and they say yes or no, this patient can be entered in, or keep moving through the screening process, right? So this patient happens to have the scan returned to the vendor on the same day as another patient. So there was 2 different scans on the same day with different patient IDs. Well, 3 months later, they realized that they didn't have the appropriate brain assigned to the 2 patient numbers. And both patients had the same brain image because they got them all confused and swapped. So in trying to figure out which one was actually the brain of the patient enrolled, we had to have a meeting, we had to meet with them, we had to figure out what was the issue, what they were doing on their end in order to figure out how they ended up putting the wrong scan attached to the brain of this patient, right? And so once they went through all of that, they did all of their due diligence, and I'll look up the right wording or think of the right wording later, but for this example. So then in order to also try to explain to our investigators, what happened with the vendor, right? So we had to work everything out with the vendor first. We figure out what went wrong. And so as the study lead, I actually have CTMs on the study that support that particular region. So the region and site support for that particular patient was on the call with the vendor with me, right? So we're both listening, we're learning what's happening, and we have to work together. So after the call, we get together and we discuss what actually went wrong, what happened. And then we know we have to go back to the site, right? And when we go back to the site, we have to explain to them, oh, sorry, you shouldn't have actually enrolled this patient because there were issues on their brain and they should have never been enrolled, right? But this patient was enrolled, and then you go back to the site and then they explain to you, we reviewed both images and we got 2 different reports. So that's why we didn't think that there was any confusion for the brain. So then, we have to go back to the vendor and figure out why is it that this person is saying that, 2 different reviewers of the same brain gave the wrong result that enabled this wrong brain to even get into the study. So then it's like another can of worms, right? So you're dealing with that. So then you're just working very closely with the vendor, trying to figure out what happened, what went wrong, clarify everything, get everything back into place, create your CAPA. You're working very closely with quality and clinical the whole time because they're overseeing the image, and the quality person is making sure we have all our ducks in a row. And then we're just working with our vendor on the CAPA, right? Going forward, when you get 2 images, and then also in the future, making sure that when you have different situations where there's a numbering issue, you just closely follow up with the project manager to make sure that they're aware that there's been an issue in the past, and you want them to specifically oversee the people that are like the technologists, like, going through all of the records and matching everything up and making sure that they double check their work extra closely because there's already been a mistake in the past. And just, keeping constant oversight of them, even if it happened like a couple months before or after, and you just can't really stop. So it's almost like a constant oversight. And I'm just making sure I'm answering your question, Hillary. Yeah.
No, I think that's really good. I think that I like the 2 key points is that I really like that you talked about because that's something that Genentech wants, is working cross-functionally, right? You talked in bringing in other departments, quality and developing your CAPA, right? You're not just talking about like what happened, you're kind of like what happened afterwards and what you need to do to make sure that this all gets documented properly. And then building in kind of a QC process, an additional process where the PM and I think maybe emphasize that you were referring to like the project manager at the imaging vendor. So maybe like the vendors, because I think when you said that, I wasn't too sure who that was at first, but then you said that they were going to oversee the technicians. So I think it's a very solid example about putting things into place so that they would prevent it from happening in the future. And then I think you would just close it out with a little bit extra, saying something along the lines of, like, now that this is in place, there hasn't been any additional issues. And it's important that we have this kind of thing in place to make sure that the correct patients get enrolled. So kind of like give a little summary about like, and then pulling it back to the patient, right? So everything could kind of end with either the patient or like the company impact.
Right.
But no, solid example, and I would definitely use it. Sorry, go ahead.
Before we move on, can we also ask like the people listening if they have other things that they thought were confusing or needed further clarification on? Because that was very kind of scattered to me.
Yeah,
so.
no, it was good. And I might, and Anka, Zane, Logan, Nick, think about if you have any comments on that. But I agree with like when it went to the site and then the site said, oh no, we did see it and it was too, you were like just starting to lose me there. I was like, okay, this is getting a little too complicated. So I might, if I was you, I might just take that part out. I like that you talk to the site and explain to them. And I think what you should maybe do is emphasize like that you explain to the site, like, this is an error with the vendor, like take accountability. I think that's another like, and I'll send you a list of like, I think I may have already, but I'll send you like a list of like kind of like Genentech like key things they look at, which I think is general for companies, but like, like working cross-functionally, accountability, just like clear communication, those kind of things. And there's a whole bunch on like leadership that I'll send too. But yeah, anyone else on the call have any feedback on, was that like confusing or any aspects to her answer? Feel free
I know.
to speak up. Yeah,
No
everyone's.
pressure.
Or you can think about it and we can move on, and then like, let us know if you have any comments.
Yeah, but for that brain, right? The PI was just upset because he was like, why did you give me a different read, right? If it was
Yeah.
actually the same brain, I shouldn't have gotten a different read. So
Yeah, no, I think that's good to share. And I think maybe, emphasize that a little bit, like the site was upset
Mhm.
about this vendor's issue. Did you go back to did you what was the vendor's reaction? Were they like super apologetic, or did they try to like make it seem like that wasn't their fault, or what?
Mhm.
What was that like?
I think it was less of an issue, right? Because they saw it.
Yeah.
It was kind of like, oh, we shouldn't have deleted a file. They just like deleted something, like,
Yeah.
it's kind of rare where someone will just delete something in clinical operations, right? Yeah, they just deleted a file, and yeah.
Okay, so they were kind of like,
Yeah.
whoops.
Yeah,
Okay.
like I don't think there was anything they could do. Do you think it would be more dramatic to make it like they were?
Yeah, I like to add a flair of dramatic. Yeah, and also I would say that as you were telling this the story, you were very animated and like smiling and like laughing, which is good. I think that's what I try to do when
Mhm.
I like give it, is I try to set like a very like animated, jovial, like positive tone.
Mhm.
And like I sometimes, if appropriate, like lay in a little jokes, or try to just keep it very lighthearted, because I feel
Okay.
like in interviews in general, it's like more serious. Um, okay, so we have 10 minutes left on our Zoom call, and we can also do more on Monday. I'm totally free for that too.
Oh, you.
Yeah, of course. I want to get you completely ready. But how about this one? This is one that I was not asked, but I thought was hard, and I was like nervous about it. But so in case you get this question, tell me of a time when you influenced a decision.
Mhm.
And so you again want to have a very specific example, and then kind of what was the outcome,
Mhm.
and kind of all of that.
Mhm.
And yeah, and take a moment to think of it.
Okay. So I was actually, um, I've been talking about this example a lot, but for the Tau PET working group that I was talking about earlier, where we have this very important biomarker collection that we need to make, when we started out early in the year, say February, our program manager had, thought of a sequence and series of things that we could do over the year to help increase recruitment. And one of those potentials was a webinar in a specific month where there wasn't like too many other activities. So I have my partner co-leading the Tau PET working group, and I told him 2 months from now, we're going to have a PET webinar for Tau to have investigators know how important it is. And, we really want to make sure that they're aware, and we want it, and we want to make sure they're doing it. And so before that time even happened, we came up with all these other plans where we'll actually survey the site, we'll get all the feedback we need about it. We know that they're on board, they're engaged, they're going to do it if they can. We've made sure that we double checked and reconciled that every single site is already ready, and their machines are qualified to do the assessments, and they're within the range of our, the vendor that actually makes the tracer for us, and the shipping distances and all that. We have all that planned. And so when we're leading up to like maybe a month away from where there might be a webinar, it's like, oh, how are things going? Have you created the timeline? Do you have this? And it was kind of like, he was like, oh, I don't really think it would be worthwhile to have the webinar after all, because of X, Y, and Z, which were very good examples, right? And so I have my program manager asking for the webinar, and I have the person who's in charge of the webinar saying, I don't think it would be a good idea to have this, and just looking at the feedback and going through the data, making an informed decision on what would be best for the patient and the sites. I get his feedback, and then I go talk to my clinical scientist, and I say, we have all of this data. We know that all the sites are engaged. We don't need to make the assessment mandatory. People are still willing to do it. And they've let us know that it's very time consuming and takes a lot of work to get the patients consented, scheduled, and do all of this stuff. And then so for us to have a frivolous webinar that you're too busy busy to prepare for and you probably don't want to do, maybe we should skip it until, it seems like it's more necessary, because patients are actually consenting for it now. And we have enough patients in screening in these countries that can actually do it. Would you be okay if we don't actually have it? And he was like, I think that's a great idea. So then I take it back to my, person leading the working group. And I was like, okay, we got buy-in. He's okay with us not doing it. So let's just take this to our program lead and let her know that we don't think it's necessary. And we've gotten buy-in from our clinical scientists. And she just kind of, I was like, are you sure? Like it could, and then, we kind of went back and forth about all the reasons why it wasn't such a necessary thing to do. And it would definitely be better on the patients because the sites have more time to, tend to their patients and really do a good job for them rather than sitting on an hour Zoom with us that they don't need, because that's not what's important. It's the patients. And so she was willing, we were able to convince her. And so we kind of influenced so that we could save time for everybody and really focus on the important stuff.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's a great, I influenced the decision. I think emphasize a little bit about like, I, collected all the data I got, and make it a little bit more about you influencing the decision. I think like, but like getting buy-in from clinical science and getting an idea. But no, I think it's a really great example of being able to save time for the site. Like we had a good idea, and then we decided not to go with it because it wasn't going to be worth it, which I think a lot of times people kind of are like, oh, we've put in effort, we therefore should do it, but that's not always the case, right? Especially if it's not needed. And I think I would maybe like add a follow-up in the sense of saying something along the lines of like, we evaluated the data, everyone's doing great, everyone's enrolling, and it seems good. Our plan is to then like kind of like answering the question of like, what's your plan moving forward? The plan would be to then reevaluate in 3 to 6 months, check the data, do another data check, and see if it's needed. Like see if there's any future, issues or need for that. Okay. No, I thought that was good. Any comments from anyone else?
I thought that one was more straightforward.
Yeah, that was straightforward. That was pretty clear.
Confusing.
Yeah, I like that. Okay. And then I had a question. This is a specific one that I got. Okay, we only have like 3 minutes, so kind of do a quick answer on this, but tell us how you handled an ambiguous situation.
An ambiguous situation.
Yeah, this one's for me. I wasn't ready for this one. I was like,
an ambiguous situation. It wasn't necessarily, I don't know if I would call it an ambiguous situation, but for me, when I hear the term ambiguous situation, I just think it wasn't as clear as one might want, right? So my example is we had a communication to create, and we wanted to make sure that the sites got a specific communication from clinical operations, and we had to work in collaboration with clinical science and regulatory and legal to make sure that everything in this communication was clear, what the sites needed and could be sent. So there was no clear timeline. The verbiage wasn't really very clear. So, we started from scratch, we sent it out, we had everyone review it. And it was kind of like, no, this is not what we want. So then it was like starting over. Okay, what did we have before? So just, asking good questions with the team, discussing what wasn't great about that. And then, just going back to the drawing board again, and then figuring out what had done previously, picking up from a previous template that the whole team had worked on before, something that was more, that was kind of what the site had already seen. So it's more of a follow-up, and we're just like editing it more to make sure that they have all the information before and now how it's going to change. So just working very closely with the team to make sure that this specific site communication is up to par, so that when it is delivered at the site, it makes perfect sense. And then the timeline, is just being flexible and making sure that all of the important components get into this site communication in a timely manner. And then it gets distributed once the whole team is aligned on the contents of it. Okay,
yeah, I think it's good. It's a tricky question. And I would maybe, of course, like when you start, don't say like, oh, I'm not too sure if it's ambiguous. But I thought it was a really I did the same thing when I started. I didn't know what to say. And so I was like, oh, I'll just get started. And then mine was also like, kind of like, I was like, well, it was a not very clear situation, right? And I needed to clarify from other people. And then I followed up, like at the end, I kind of solidified and like used the word like ambiguous. I'm like, it was ambiguous because the communication wasn't that clear, and the timelines weren't all that clear. So I kind of like summarized it by using the word ambiguous.
Right.
So definitely like make it seem, I sold the ambiguity of my situation, if that makes sense. Like it wasn't super ambiguous, but yeah.
Hillary, can we debrief on a hangout?
Yes, we'll definitely debrief, and then I do think we can also, I have like a whole list of questions, and I'd love you to rock this. So we can definitely do again on Monday if that works for you.
Yeah, but can I just call you real quick after this?
Yeah. Sounds good. All right. Thank you,
Bye, everyone. Sorry if I tortured you.
Yeah.